Hi, I'm Valentino Ordrick. The day of our annual family meeting in Brookhaven, I stopped to help a stranded employee fix her car in the parking garage. Because of that, I was 20 minutes late. And for being late, they called me a pathetic failure and the family disappointment. My own brother said I'd never amount to anything, that I was just dragging down the family name. My sister laughed when I mentioned my little projects. But here's what they didn't know: that employee I helped? She walked into our meeting 30 minutes later with a folder that would change everything. But what she revealed next didn't just shatter their arrogance. It exposed how little they actually knew about the family's real financial situation. Want to know how I turned their intervention into their resignation letters? The conference room at Pinnacle Heights had never felt so small, and by the end of that meeting, they realized they'd been mocking their own boss for 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November rain in Westfield had that particular bite that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing, no matter how prepared you thought you were. I sat in my modest Honda Civic outside the towering glass structure of Pinnacle Heights Corporate Center, watching the windshield wipers struggle against the downpour. The parking garage beneath the building was already half full with luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, Audis, the kind of vehicles that announced their owners' success before they even stepped out. My family always chose this place for our quarterly meetings, not because it was convenient, but because it made a statement. The Ordrick family had standards to maintain, appearances to uphold, and somehow my presence at these gatherings always seemed to diminish both. I checked my phone, 2:47 p.m. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. sharp, and knowing my brother Roick, he'd already arrived 15 minutes early, straightened his tie 3 times, and positioned himself at the head of the conference table like he was chairing a board meeting instead of a family discussion about our late grandmother's estate. Roick Calvane, he'd changed his last name when he married into wealth, worked as a senior analyst at Meridian Financial Solutions. He drove a silver BMW, lived in a gated community in Hampton Hills, and never let anyone forget either fact. Our sister Elmira Fenwick held a management position at Sterling & Associates, a prestigious consulting firm downtown. She'd married a partner at a law firm and spent most of her time networking at charity galas and country club events. Then there was me, Valentino Ordrick, the family disappointment. The one who dropped out of business school to pursue his passions. The one who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a coffee shop in the old district. The one who drove a 7-year-old Honda and wore the same 3 blazers to every family function. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that those little projects they mocked had quietly grown into something much larger than any of their corporate positions. But explaining that to them had always felt like trying to describe color to someone who'd never seen anything but black and white. I grabbed my worn leather portfolio from the passenger seat and made my way toward the elevator. The portfolio had been a graduation gift from my grandmother 5 years ago, back when she still believed I might amount to something. It was genuine leather, well made, but it had aged in a way that showed its use rather than its value. Roick once called it shabby at a family dinner. Elmira had suggested I invest in something more professional if I wanted to be taken seriously. The elevator climbed to the 14th floor, each ding marking another floor between me and what I knew would be another exercise in humiliation disguised as family concern. The Ordrick quarterly meetings had started 3 years ago when our grandmother began showing signs of dementia. Initially, they'd been about coordinating her care and managing her affairs. But after her passing 18 months ago, they'd evolved into something else entirely. Interventions disguised as estate discussions. Uncle Carl had been the family's unofficial patriarch since our father passed when we were teenagers. He'd built a successful construction business from nothing, retired comfortably, and now spent his time dispensing advice that everyone pretended to appreciate. He meant well, but he'd never quite understood why I'd walked away from the clear path to success that business school had offered. I could hear their voices as I approached the conference room door. Roick's controlled tenor, Elmira's sharp laugh, Carl's gravelly observations. They were already discussing me, of course. They always started without me, even when I was on time, which I rarely was. "He needs structure," Roick was saying as I paused outside the door. "Direction. Maybe we can help him find a position somewhere, something entry-level where he can learn responsibility." "The problem is attitude," Elmira replied. He's 32 years old and still acts like he's finding himself. At some point, you have to face reality. Carl's voice carried the weight of years. The boy's got potential, always has, but potential doesn't pay bills or build legacy. His grandmother left him that inheritance hoping he'd invest it wisely, not waste it on art supplies and pipe dreams. Art supplies and pipe dreams. That's what they called the investments I'd been making for the past 4 years. The digital platforms I'd quietly acquired, the small tech companies I'd bought and integrated, the software solutions I'd developed and licensed. To them, if it wasn't a traditional corporate job with a clear title and visible office space, it was just expensive hobbies. I straightened my shoulders, took a breath, and pushed open the glass door. The conversation stopped immediately, replaced by the kind of silence that follows when people realize they've been overheard. Valentino, Uncle Carl stood up, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Good to see you, son." Rowick glanced at his watch with theatrical precision. Running a bit behind schedule, as usual. Elmira didn't look up from her phone, but her voice carried that familiar mix of condescension and concern that she'd perfected over the years. "Traffic must have been terrible in your part of town." My part of town. As if geography alone explained everything wrong with my life choices. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the one that positioned me as the recipient, rather than a participant in whatever intervention they'd planned this time. The leather portfolio felt heavier than usual as I set it down, weighted not with documents but with the accumulated years of these meetings. "Before we begin," Carl said, settling back into his chair, "I want everyone to remember that we're family. Whatever gets discussed here today, whatever decisions we make, they come from a place of love and concern for each other." Rowick had already spread several manila folders across the table in front of him, each one labeled and organized with the precision of someone who'd never learned the difference between efficiency and control. "I've prepared some materials for today's discussion," he announced, as if we were shareholders rather than siblings. Elmira finally looked up from her phone, her manicured fingers drumming against the glass table. "I think we all know why we're here." But I didn't know, not entirely. These meetings had become predictable in their unpredictability. Sometimes they focused on what they saw as my financial irresponsibility. Other times they'd prepare job opportunities they thought might suit my limited skill set. Once, memorably, Elmira had brought brochures for graduate programs in business administration, as if returning to school would magically transform me into the brother they'd prefer to have. What I did know was that whatever they'd planned, it would be presented as being for my own good. They'd speak about me as if I weren't in the room, make decisions about my life as if I weren't capable of making them myself, and conclude by expressing how much they loved me, despite my disappointing trajectory. The rain continued to drum against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the tension in the room. 14 floors below, people were going about their daily lives, unaware that in this glass box in the sky, a family was about to tear itself apart in the name of helping one of its own. Rowick cleared his throat and opened the first folder. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about Valentino's future." And there it was. Not our future as a family, not our shared responsibilities, but my future as if it were something that belonged to all of us equally. I folded my hands in my lap and prepared for another hour of listening to my life being dissected by people who'd never bothered to understand it. The meeting had been scheduled to start at 3 p.m., but I found myself sitting in my car at 2:45, staring at the entrance to the Pinnacle Heights parking garage. The rain had intensified, turning the afternoon gray and making the concrete structure look even more uninviting than usual. Through my windshield, I could see the familiar collection of luxury vehicles that always marked these family gatherings. Rowick's BMW, Elmira's white Lexus, and Uncle Carl's massive pickup truck that cost more than most people's cars, despite being designed to look utilitarian. I was reaching for my portfolio when I heard it, the sound of an engine sputtering, then dying completely. It came from somewhere deeper in the garage, echoing off the concrete walls with the kind of finality that meant someone's day had just gotten significantly worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My first instinct was to ignore it. I was already cutting it close with the meeting time, and arriving late would only give them more ammunition for whatever intervention they'd planned today. But the sound came again, followed by what was unmistakably someone kicking a tire in frustration. I found myself getting out of the car before I'd consciously decided to help. Maybe it was the way the sound echoed in the empty spaces between cars, lonely and defeated. Maybe it was because I knew exactly how it felt to have everything fall apart at the worst possible moment. The source of the trouble was 3 rows over, a woman in a navy blue business suit standing next to a silver Honda Accord with its hood propped open. She was holding her phone in one hand and what looked like jumper cables in the other, staring at the engine with the expression of someone who understood the theory but not the practice. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice carrying farther than expected in the concrete space. "Car trouble?" She looked up, and I recognized her immediately, though I couldn't place from where. Mid-30s, professional demeanor, the kind of composed appearance that suggested competence in most areas of life except, apparently, automotive repair. "The battery's completely dead," she said, holding up the jumper cables. "I know how these are supposed to work, but I've never actually had to use them." I walked over and looked at the engine. It was a straightforward situation. Dead battery, clean terminals, everything accessible. A 5-minute fix with the right equipment. "I can help with that," I said, gesturing toward my Honda. "Just need to pull my car over." "Are you sure?" "I don't want to impose. I could call roadside assistance, but they said it might be an hour or more in this weather." "It's no problem, really." As I maneuvered my Honda closer to hers, I caught a glimpse of the time on my dashboard, 2:52 p.m. The family meeting would be starting in 8 minutes, and I still needed to get to the 14th floor. But there was something about the situation that made the meeting feel less urgent, less inevitable. The jumpstart process was straightforward, but the woman, who introduced herself as Leora Sindrell, seemed genuinely interested in understanding each step. She asked questions about the positive and negative terminals, about why the order of connection mattered, about how long to let the working engine run before attempting to start the dead one. "I should probably learn this stuff," she said as we waited for her battery to charge. "My brother always handled car issues when we were growing up, and then I moved in with roommates who knew about engines. Now I live alone and realize I've got some significant gaps in my practical knowledge." "Everyone's got gaps somewhere," I replied. "The trick is being willing to learn when the situation comes up." Her engine turned over on the first try, purring to life with the satisfied sound of machinery working as intended. Leora's face lit up with genuine relief and gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said as we disconnected the cables. "I'm actually on my way to a really important meeting upstairs. If you hadn't stopped, I would have been completely screwed." "Upstairs?" I looked toward the elevator, suddenly curious. "What floor?" 14th. "Some kind of family business meeting. I work for one of the companies that has offices here, and they asked me to bring some documents." She hesitated, then added, "I probably shouldn't say more than that, confidentiality and all." A strange chill ran down my spine. The 14th floor. The same floor where my family was gathered, probably already 5 minutes into their discussion of my failures and shortcomings. "What company do you work for?" "Meridian Financial Solutions. I'm in the research department." She paused, studying my face. "You look familiar. Do we know each other?" "Meridian Financial Solutions. Rowick's company." The pieces clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. "I don't think we've met," I said carefully, "but I might know your colleague Rowick Calvane." "Oh, Rowick. Yes, he's actually the one who requested the documentation I'm delivering. Small world." She glanced at her watch. "Speaking of which, I really should get upstairs. Thanks again for the help. You're a lifesaver." As she hurried toward the elevator, I found myself standing in the parking garage, processing what had just happened. Leora worked for Rowick's company and was on her way to deliver documents to a meeting on the 14th floor. The same meeting I was supposed to be at. The same meeting that was now officially late for. My phone buzzed with a text from Elmira. "Where are you? We're starting without you." I looked at the message, then at the elevator doors closing behind Leora, then back at my phone. Starting without me had become the standard procedure at these meetings anyway. They'd spend the first 10 or 15 minutes discussing my situation as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be consulted. My tardiness would be noted, analyzed, and added to the growing list of evidence for whatever case they were building. But something about helping Leora had shifted my perspective on the afternoon. Instead of dreading the meeting, I found myself curious about what documents Rowick had requested from his company's research department for a family gathering. Financial analysis wasn't typically part of our quarterly discussions about grandmother's estate, and the inheritance issues had been settled months ago. I made my way to the elevator, still thinking about the conversation. Leora had seemed surprised that Rowick had requested her personally for the document delivery. She'd mentioned confidentiality as if the information were sensitive beyond the usual family financial discussions. The elevator climbed to the 14th floor with mechanical indifference, each ding marking another moment of delay that would undoubtedly be mentioned when I walked into the conference room. But for the first time in months, I wasn't entering one of these meetings with the resigned dread that had become my default emotional state. Instead, I found myself wondering what kind of research Rowick needed for a family meeting, why he'd requested it through official company channels, and why Leora Sindrell had looked at me with that flicker of recognition when I'd mentioned his name. The elevator doors opened onto the familiar hallway leading to the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see my family already deep in conversation. Manila folders spread across the table, serious expressions all around. Uncle Carl was nodding gravely at something Rowick was explaining. Elmira was taking notes in her precise handwriting. And in approximately 30 seconds, I was going to walk through that door and find out what kind of meeting required confidential research documents from Meridian Financial Solutions. I pushed through the glass door at exactly 3:08 p.m., still slightly damp from the rain and carrying the faint scent of motor oil from helping with the car repair. The conversation didn't just stop. It died completely, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire room. Uncle Carl looked up first, his weathered face showing mild concern rather than irritation. "There you are, Valentino. Everything all right?" "Car trouble in the garage," I said, settling into my designated chair at the far end of the table. "Had to help someone with a jump start." Rowick made a show of checking his expensive watch. 8 minutes late, again. He didn't look up from the papers in front of him, but his tone carried the weight of accumulated disappointments. "We've already covered the preliminary items." Elmira finally glanced up from her phone, her expression mixing annoyance with what she probably thought was sisterly concern. "You know, Valentino, punctuality is really just basic respect for other people's time. If you can't manage that, how can you manage anything else?" The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied these meetings. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the satisfaction of having actually helped someone. Or maybe it was curiosity about what had brought Leora to this same floor. But I didn't feel the usual urge to apologize or deflect. "Sometimes helping people takes priority over schedule adherence," I said simply. Rowick's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that's gotten you into this mess, Valentino. Always prioritizing feeling good over being responsible." "What mess?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but the assumption in his voice had triggered something defensive in me. The three of them exchanged glances, the kind of coordinated look that suggested they'd rehearsed this conversation before I arrived. Carl cleared his throat, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone delivering difficult news. "Son, we asked you here today because we're worried about you." "Really worried?" Elmira leaned forward, her manicured fingers interlaced on the table. "We've been watching you struggle for years now, and it's time for some honest conversation about your future." "My struggle?" I looked around the table, genuinely confused. "What exactly do you think I'm struggling with?" Rowick opened the first manila folder with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Let's start with employment history. You've been unemployed for what, 3 years now?" "I'm self-employed, there's a difference." "Self-employed doing what exactly?" Elmira's voice carried that particular blend of skepticism and condescension she'd perfected in her consulting work. "Because from what we can see, you spend your time on hobbies and call it work." Carl raised his hand slightly, trying to moderate the tone. "What your brother and sister are trying to say is that we can't see any evidence of steady income or career progression. And at 32, Valentino, that's concerning." I felt heat rising in my face, but I forced my voice to remain level. "You can't see evidence because you've never asked to see it. You've just assumed." "Okay," Rowick said, leaning back with the confidence of someone about to win an argument. "Show us. What's your annual income? What are your business expenses? Where's your tax return?" The questions were fair, I had to admit, but they were also beside the point. The information they wanted existed. but in forms they wouldn't recognize or value. Digital assets, software licensing agreements, revenue streams from platforms they'd never heard of. None of it would translate into the kind of traditional employment metrics they were looking for. "It's complicated," I said, knowing how weak that sounded even as the words left my mouth. Elmira actually laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the rain, drumming against the windows. "It's complicated. Valentino, business isn't complicated. You provide a service, you get paid for it, you can document the transaction. If you can't explain what you do in simple terms, you probably aren't doing anything." Uncle Carl spread his hands on the table, his expression genuinely concerned. "Look, son, we're not trying to attack you, we're trying to help. But you have to understand how this looks from the outside. You live in a tiny apartment, you drive an old car, you dress like someone who can't afford better clothes. And now you're 32 with no clear career path, no retirement savings, no stability. You don't know anything about my financial situation," I said, but the words came out defensive rather than confident. "Then enlighten us," Rowick shot back. "Because what we see is someone who inherited $40,000 from our grandmother 18 months ago and has apparently burned through most of it on whatever projects you won't explain." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Not because it was true. The inheritance had been carefully invested and had actually grown substantially, but because it revealed how little they thought of me. In their minds, I was someone who would waste our grandmother's final gift on irresponsible purchases. "You think I squandered her inheritance?" My voice was quieter now, more hurt than angry. Elmira's expression softened slightly, but her words remained sharp. "What else are we supposed to think? You won't talk about your work. You can't show us any evidence of success, and you certainly aren't living like someone who's built anything substantial." "Maybe the problem is your definition of success," I said. Rowick slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. "Don't give us philosophy, Valentino. Give us facts. Show us bank statements, show us contracts, show us anything that proves you're not just a 32-year-old failure living in Fantasyland." The word hit the room like a gunshot. Failure. Not struggling, not misunderstood, not taking an unconventional path. Failure. Uncle Carl shot Rowick a warning look, but the damage was done. The word hung in the air between us. Impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. "Is that what you think I am?" I asked quietly. "A failure?" The silence stretched, for what felt like minutes. Elmira looked down at her hands. Carl studied the rain on the windows. Only Rowick met my eyes, and what I saw there was a mixture of frustration, disappointment, and something that might have been pity. "I think you're someone with potential who's wasting it," he said finally. "I think you're someone who could have a good life if you'd stop pretending that wanting something badly enough makes it real." "And I think you're the family disappointment," Elmira added, her voice gentler now but somehow more cutting because of it. "The one we all worry about, the one we make excuses for, the one who proves that good intentions aren't enough." Carl leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when we were teenagers and needed guidance. "Valentino, we love you, that's why we're here. But love means being honest, even when it hurts. And the honest truth is that you're 32 years old with nothing to show for the last decade of your life, except a bunch of projects that haven't gone anywhere." The rain outside had intensified, turning the windows into rivers of distortion that made the city beyond look like it was melting. Inside the conference room, the silence was broken only by the sound of Elmira tapping her pen against her notebook and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. "So what exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Rowick opened another folder, this one thicker than the first. "We've put together some options. Entry-level positions at reputable companies, graduate programs that might give you marketable skills, even a small business loan if you can present an actual business plan." Basically, Elmira said, we're offering to help you build a real life, but you have to want it. I looked around the table at the three people who'd helped raise me, who'd supported me through our father's death and our mother's struggles with depression, who'd celebrated my high school graduation and my college acceptance, people who genuinely believed they were helping me. And I realized that despite all their good intentions, despite all their love and concern, they had absolutely no idea who I had become over the past 4 years. They were still seeing the college dropout who'd walked away from business school, not the person who'd built something substantial in the digital spaces they didn't understand or recognize. What if I told you that you're wrong about everything? I said quietly. Carl smiled sadly. Son, we'd love to be wrong, but we need more than just your word at this point. What would it take? What kind of proof would convince you that I'm not the failure you think I am? Rauik leaned forward, his expression challenging. Show us $1 million in assets. Show us a business that generates six-figure annual revenue. Show us anything that proves you've built something real instead of just talking about it. The number hung in the air between us, arbitrary but specific, a gauntlet thrown down in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building where my family had gathered to save me from myself. $1 million, I repeated. In documentable, verifiable assets, Elmira clarified. Not wishful thinking or future potential, real money. I nodded slowly, processing not just the challenge but the assumptions behind it. They'd set the bar impossibly high because they were certain I couldn't clear it. In their minds, I was someone who needed to be convinced to aim lower, not someone who might already have exceeded their expectations. Outside, the storm was building intensity, and somewhere in the building below us, Leora Sindrell was probably making her way to this floor with documents that Rauik had requested for reasons I still didn't understand. Okay, I said finally, $1 million in verifiable assets. Okay, Uncle Carl looked confused. What does that mean? It means I accept the challenge. Rauik's laugh was short and bitter. Valentino, this isn't a game. This is your life. You can't just... He was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by the sound of the glass door opening. Leora Sindrell stepped into the conference room, and I felt the entire dynamic shift in ways that no one else at the table could have anticipated. She was carrying a manila folder and looked slightly apologetic for the interruption. I'm sorry to disturb your meeting, but I have the documents that Mr. Calvain requested. Rauik straightened in his chair, suddenly looking uncomfortable. Miss Sindrell, thank you for bringing those. You can just leave them on the side table. But Leora didn't move toward the side table. Instead, her eyes found mine across the room, and I saw that flicker of recognition again, stronger this time. Actually, I think there might be some confusion about these documents. Elmira looked between Rauik and Leora with growing suspicion. What kind of documents? Financial research reports, Leora said, still holding the folder. Background checks on investment accounts and asset holdings. Mr. Calvain requested them through our corporate research division. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Uncle Carl was frowning at Rauik with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Rauik, what you talking about? Rauik's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. It's nothing dramatic, just some routine verification work. For the family trust discussions. What family trust discussions? I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. We settled all of grandmother's estate issues months ago. Leora was still holding the folder, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. I'm sorry, but I think I should clarify something. These aren't general family trust documents. They're specifically background investigations on Valentino Ordrick. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain outside seemed to pause, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Background investigations? Carl's voice had lost its usual warmth, taking on the edge he'd once used with subcontractors who'd tried to cheat him. Rauik, what the hell is going on? Rauik was looking everywhere except at me. It's not what it sounds like. I just wanted to verify some things before we had this conversation. Verify what things? Elmira demanded, though something in her expression suggested she already knew more than she was admitting. Leora glanced at me, then at the folder in her hands. The research request was specifically for asset verification, income source analysis, and corporate ownership documentation for Valentino Ordrick. Quite extensive, actually. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. You had me investigated? Not investigated, Rauik said quickly, just researched. Financial due diligence. I wanted to understand your actual situation before we offered help. Help? The word came out as a bark of bitter laughter. You call this help? Carl's voice was dangerously quiet. Rauik, did you or did you not hire a research company to investigate your own brother? It's not like I hired private detectives, Rauik said, his defensive tone making him sound younger than his 35 years. I used our corporate research division to run standard financial background checks, the kind of thing we do for potential investment clients. Investment clients? I stood up from my chair, the leather portfolio falling to the floor. You investigated me like I was some kind of business risk? Elmira was staring at her hands, and I realized she'd known. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just Rowick's idea. They'd planned this together. Elmira? Carl's voice carried the weight of someone who'd just discovered his favorite niece had stolen from the church collection plate. Were you part of this? She looked up, her composure finally cracking. We were worried, Uncle Carl, really worried. And when someone won't be honest about their situation, sometimes you have to find other ways to get the truth. The truth? I could hear my voice rising, but I didn't care anymore. You want the truth? Here's the truth. You had me investigated by a corporate research firm because you couldn't be bothered to actually talk to me like a human being. Leora cleared her throat softly. I'm sorry, but should I leave these documents or… No, I said, turning to face her. Don't leave them. I want to hear what kind of truth my family bought and paid for. Rowick reached for the folder. Valentino, this isn't necessary. We can discuss this privately. Nothing about this has been private, I shot back. You've been discussing my life, my finances, my future without me for months. So let's put everything on the table. I looked directly at Leora. What did your research find? She glanced nervously at Rowick, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. I really think this should be handled through proper channels. The proper channel is right here, I said, gesturing around the conference room. My brother paid your company to investigate me, presumably to use that information in this family meeting. So let's hear it. Carl stood up slowly, his face dark with anger. Leora, is it? Ma'am, I'm Carl Mallorik, and I'm asking you directly, what did your investigation find? The authority in his voice was unmistakable. This was the man who'd built a construction empire from nothing, who'd negotiated with union bosses and city officials, who'd never backed down from a confrontation when the stakes mattered. Leora responded to that authority immediately. The investigation found extensive digital asset holdings, quote, she said, opening the folder despite Rowick's increasingly frantic gestures. Multiple corporate entities, software licensing agreements, and what appears to be significant investment portfolio diversification. Elmira's head snapped up. What does that mean in plain English? Leora looked at me, then back at the folder. In plain English, it means that Mr. Ordrick has built a substantial business portfolio that generates significant passive income. The room went dead quiet, except for the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of traffic 14 floors below. How significant? Carl asked quietly. Leora hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the position she'd been put in. The preliminary assessment shows liquid assets in excess of $1.2 million, with additional holdings that were more difficult to evaluate without deeper investigation. The number hit the room like a bomb, $1.2 million. More than Rowick's challenge, more than any of them had expected, more than they'd believed possible. That can't be right, Elmira whispered. Rowick was staring at the folder as if it contained evidence of alien life. There has to be some mistake. You investigated the wrong person, or the data is corrupted, or… The data is accurate, Leora said firmly. We triple-checked everything because the initial results were so far above the baseline expectations provided by the requesting party. I felt something shift inside me, not triumph exactly, but a kind of settling. Like a building finding its foundation after years of swaying in the wind. What were the baseline expectations? Leora glanced at Rowick, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. The request suggested we'd find minimal assets, possibly some debt, and no evidence of substantial business activity. In other words, I said slowly, my brother told your research team that I was broke and unemployed, and asked you to prove it. The accusation hung in the air. And this time, Rowick couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Not mine, not Carl's, not even Elmira's. It wasn't like that, he said weakly. Then what was it like? Carl's voice could have cut glass. Before Rowick could answer, Leora continued reading from the folder. The investigation also revealed that Mr. Ordrick is the majority owner of several companies, including what appears to be significant holdings in… She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as she read something in the documents. What is it? I asked. She looked up at me, then at Rowick, then back at the folder. This can't be right either. What can't be right? Leora's voice was barely above a whisper when she answered. According to this research, you own controlling interest in Meridian Financial Solutions. The words hit Rowick like a physical blow. He actually swayed in his chair, his face going from pale to gray. "That's impossible," he breathed. But it wasn't impossible. It was just invisible, hidden behind layers of corporate structure and digital transactions that my family had never bothered to understand or investigate until now. "Rowick," I said quietly, "where exactly did you think you were working?" The conference room had become a vacuum of sound, as if the revelation had sucked all the air out of the space. Rowick sat frozen in his chair, staring at the research folder like it was evidence of his own execution. Elmiora's pen had stopped moving across her notepad. Uncle Carl was looking back and forth between me and Rowick, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't balance. Leora stood in the middle of this tableau, clearly wishing she could disappear back into the elevator and pretend this conversation had never happened. But there was no undoing what had been revealed, no way to stuff the information back into the folder and return to ignorance. "Controlling interest," Carl repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense when spoken aloud. "Valentino, is this true?" I looked around the table at my family, really looked at them, maybe for the first time in years. These were the people who'd raised me, supported me, worried about me, and ultimately decided to investigate me because they couldn't believe I might have succeeded without their guidance or approval. "Yes," I said simply, "it's true." Rowick's voice came out as a croak. "How is that possible?" "It's possible because you never asked the right questions," I replied. "You assumed I was failing because you couldn't see traditional markers of success. You looked for employment records instead of business registrations. You looked for salary information instead of equity positions." Elmira finally found her voice. "But how did you buy a company like Meridian? That's not exactly a corner store investment." The question was fair, and the answer was complex in ways that would probably take hours to fully explain. But the short version was simpler than they might expect. "I didn't buy Meridian as an established company," I said. "I bought the debt when it was in financial trouble 4 years ago, restructured the ownership and built it back up." Leora was reading through more of the documents, her expression growing more surprised with each page. "Mr. Ordrick, according to this research, you also own substantial positions in Sterling and Associates, the consulting firm where Elmira works," I finished. "Yes, I know." Elmira's face went white. "That's impossible. Sterling is a family-owned business. The Harrington family has controlled it for 3 generations." "The Harrington family sold their controlling stake 18 months ago," I said quietly. "They needed capital for a European expansion that didn't work out. I bought their position through a private equity arrangement." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Less shocked, more calculating, as if everyone was suddenly reassessing not just what they'd learned, but what it meant for their own positions. Uncle Carl was the first to recover his equilibrium. "Son, why didn't you tell us any of this?" It was the question I'd been expecting, and one I'd thought about many times over the past few years. The answer was both simple and complicated, obvious and painful. "When would I have told you?" I asked. "At the quarterly meetings where you discussed my failures before I arrived. During the phone calls where you offered to help me find entry-level jobs. At family dinners where you suggested I needed more direction and structure." Carl's expression was pained, but he nodded slowly. "You're saying we didn't give you the opportunity." "I'm saying you decided what story you wanted to believe about me, and you never asked if it was true." Rowick was staring at the table, his voice barely audible. "I've been working for you for 3 years. You've been working for Meridian Financial Solutions," I corrected, "which has been run by an excellent management team that I hired specifically because they knew the business better than I did. Your job performance has been outstanding, by the way. Your salary reviews have been excellent." The information hit him like successive physical blows. He'd been succeeding at a company owned by the brother he'd dismissed as a failure. His career advancement had been happening under the authority of someone he'd just called pathetic. Elmira was doing calculations in her head, her consulting background automatically analyzing the implications. "If you own controlling interest in both companies, that means I'm technically both of your bosses," I said, "though I've never interfered with day-to-day operations or management decisions." Leora was still reading through the research documents, occasionally glancing up with expressions of increasing amazement. "Mr. Ordrick, there are also holdings in real estate development, software companies, and what looks like a substantial investment portfolio. The total asset evaluation is significantly higher than the preliminary assessment." "How much higher?" Carl asked. She consulted the documents. The comprehensive evaluation suggests total holdings in excess of $8.5 million. The number landed in the room like a meteorite, reshaping everything around it. $8.5 million. Not the million-dollar challenge Rauch had thrown down as an impossible standard, but nearly 10 times that amount. Elmira was the first to grasp the full implications. Valentino, if these numbers are accurate, you're not just successful, you're wealthy, genuinely wealthy. I'm comfortable, I said carefully. But wealth was never the point. Then what was the point? Rauch asked, his voice hollow. I looked at him, then at Elmira, then at Uncle Carl, trying to find words for something I'd never had to explain before. The point was building something meaningful. Creating value, solving problems. The money was just a way to keep score. But why didn't you tell us? Elmira pressed. Why let us think you were struggling? The question hung in the air, and I realized this was the moment when I had to decide how honest to be. I could give them the comfortable answer, the one that would preserve family relationships and avoid difficult conversations. Or I could tell them the truth. Because you never asked what I was actually doing, I said finally. You asked why I wasn't doing what you thought I should be doing. You offered to help me find the kind of job you understood, live the kind of life you recognized as successful. But you never once asked if I was happy with my choices, or if my choices were working. Carl leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands flat on the table. So you let us worry about you for years when there was no reason to worry. There was plenty of reason to worry, I replied. But not about my finances, or my career prospects. You could have worried about whether I was lonely, or whether I was finding meaning in my work, or whether I was maintaining relationships outside of business. Instead, you worried about whether I could pay rent. The observations stung, and I could see it in their faces. They'd reduced their concern for me to the most basic metrics: employment, income, social status. They'd never asked about my happiness, my fulfillment, my sense of purpose. Leora cleared her throat softly. I should probably return to my office with these documents. Actually, I said, turning to face her, I'd like you to stay for a few more minutes. There's something else I want to discuss with my family, and since you work for one of my companies, you should probably hear it too. Rauch looked up sharply. What kind of something else? I walked to the window and looked out at the city spread below us. The rain was still falling but lighter now, more like mist than storm. 14 floors below, people were going about their daily lives, working jobs, building careers, making choices that would ripple through their futures in ways they couldn't predict. I want to discuss what happens next, I said, still facing the window, because now that everyone knows the truth, we have decisions to make. When I turned back to face the room, I saw 3 family members who looked like they'd been fundamentally recalibrated, and one employee who was clearly wondering what she'd gotten herself into by agreeing to deliver a folder of documents. What kind of decisions? Carl asked carefully. I smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. The kind of decisions that will determine whether this family learns to function based on truth instead of assumptions. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled with the promise of more storms to come. The silence in the conference room had weight to it now, pressing down on everyone like the storm clouds gathering outside. I remained standing by the windows, watching the city blur and sharpen through the rain-streaked glass, while my family sat frozen around the mahogany table trying to process a reality that had been completely inverted in the space of 30 minutes. Leora stood near the door, still holding the research folder, looking like someone who'd accidentally wandered into a family therapy session disguised as a corporate meeting. The documents in her hands had become more than just research. They were evidence of assumptions challenged, relationships redefined, and power structures completely overturned. So what happens next? Uncle Carl asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. What do you want from us, Valentino? I turned away from the window and looked at him. Really looked at him, for the first time in years, without the filter of his disappointment or my defensive reaction to it. Carl Malrick had built his construction company through decades of hard work, honest dealing, and clear communication. He'd raised me and my siblings after our father died, stepping into a role he'd never asked for but had handled with dignity and love. He deserved an honest answer. I want to understand something, I said, walking back toward the table but not sitting down. I want to understand how 3 people who claimed to love me could decide to have me investigated like a suspected criminal, rather than simply asking me directly about my life. Rowick shifted in his chair, his face still pale from the revelation that he'd been working for me without knowing it. It wasn't meant to be malicious, Valentino. We were genuinely worried. Stop. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through his explanation. Don't tell me what you meant. Tell me what you did. Elmira looked up from her notepad, where she'd been doodling nervous geometric patterns instead of taking actual notes. What we did was care about you enough to try to understand your situation when you wouldn't explain it yourself. No, I said, my voice gaining strength. What you did was decide that I was lying to you, and that the only way to get the truth was to pay strangers to investigate me behind my back. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or dispel. Leora cleared her throat softly, and I realized she was probably getting a masterclass in family dysfunction that she'd never asked for. Leora, I said, turning to face her, would you mind sharing with us what exactly my brother requested when he hired your research team? She glanced nervously at Rowick, who gave a slight shake of his head, but I was past caring about his comfort level. Please, I said. I think we're beyond confidentiality concerns at this point. Leora opened the folder and consulted her notes. The initial request was for what we call a financial vulnerability assessment. The client wanted to understand debt levels, employment gaps, and potential substance abuse or gambling issues that might explain erratic financial behavior. Uncle Carl's head snapped toward Rowick. You told them to look for drug problems? It's a standard part of the assessment, Rowick said defensively. I didn't specifically request it, but when someone has unexplained gaps in traditional employment— Traditional employment, I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. So in your mind, if I wasn't working a job you understood, I must be either lying about my income or funding my lifestyle through addiction or gambling. That's not what I thought, Rowick protested, but the weakness in his voice suggested otherwise. Then what did you think? I pressed. Because according to Miss Sindrell, you provided baseline expectations, that I was broke and unemployed. You essentially paid professionals to prove that your brother was a failure. Elmira stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. That's not fair, Valentino. We've been watching you for years, living in that tiny apartment, driving that old car, wearing the same clothes to every family gathering. What were we supposed to think? You were supposed to think that maybe, just maybe, I had reasons for my choices that weren't based on financial limitations, I said. You were supposed to consider that perhaps I valued different things than you did. Like what? She shot back. What values require you to live like you're barely getting by when you apparently have millions of dollars in assets? The question was fair, and it deserved a real answer. I walked to the head of the table, where Uncle Carl sat, and placed my hands flat on the mahogany surface. I live modestly because I remember what it was like when Dad died and Mom was working 3 jobs to keep us housed and fed, I said quietly. I drive an older car because it's reliable and because I don't need a vehicle to validate my worth. I wear simple clothes because I'm more interested in what I accomplish than how I look while accomplishing it. Carl nodded slowly. Those are good values, son, but they don't explain why you let us worry about you. You weren't worried about me, I replied. You were disappointed in me. There's a difference. The distinction hit the room like a slap. Rowick looked like he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Elmira sat back down heavily, her expression troubled. Every conversation we had about my future was based on the assumption that I was failing. I continued. Every suggestion you made, every opportunity you offered, every intervention you planned was designed to fix what you saw as my inability to succeed in the real world. Because you never gave us any reason to think otherwise, Elmira said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. I gave you every reason, I said. I was happy. I was engaged in meaningful work. I was financially stable. I was contributing to my community in ways you never bothered to ask about. But none of that mattered because it didn't look like success in the way you recognized it. Leora was still standing by the door, and I realized she'd been a witness to something more than just a family disagreement. She'd seen the moment when years of assumptions collided with uncomfortable truths. Miss Sindrell, I said, in your professional opinion, what do you think the biggest red flag was in this investigation? She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn deeper into family dynamics. I'm not sure I should. Please, I said. I think your perspective as an outside observer might be valuable. She consulted the folder again, then looked up. The biggest red flag was that the requesting party seemed to be hoping for negative results. Most financial investigations are designed to verify assets or confirm positive indicators. This one was structured to find problems. Uncle Carl's expression darkened. "Is that true, Rowick? Did you ask them to find evidence that Valentino was in trouble?" Rowick's silence was answer enough. "Jesus Christ," Carl breathed. "You were trying to prove your own brother was a screw-up." "I was trying to get ammunition for an intervention," Rowick said finally. "I thought if we had documentation of his financial problems, we could convince him to accept help." "Help," I repeated. "You mean control." "That's not—" "Yes, it is." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. "Rowick, what's your employee ID number at Meridian Financial?" He looked confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just answer the question." "MF4471. Why?" I dialed the number and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a professional voice answered, "Meridian Financial Solutions, Human Resources." "This is Valentino Ordrick," I said. "I need to speak with Director Hamilton about employee MF4471. "One moment, sir." Rowick's face had gone from pale to gray. Elmira was staring at the phone like it might explode. Uncle Carl was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mr. Ordrick," a woman's voice came through the speaker. "This is Janet Hamilton. How can I help you?" "I need a complete personnel file review for employee MF4471, Rowick Calvane. Performance evaluations, disciplinary actions, salary history, and any recent concerning behavior reports." "Certainly, sir. Should I send that to your usual email address?" "No, I'll hold while you pull the highlights." The silence in the conference room was deafening. Rowick was staring at me with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Sir," Janet Hamilton's voice returned, "employee Calvane has an excellent performance record. Top-tier evaluations, no disciplinary actions, consistent promotion track. His most recent salary review included a 12% increase based on exceptional client management. Any ethical concerns, conflicts of interest, anything that might affect his continued employment?" Rowick's hands were shaking now. "Nothing in his official file, sir. However, I should note that he recently requested extensive research services through our corporate division for what he described as personal family matters. The request was flagged because it involved background investigations on individuals not connected to company business." "Thank you, Janet. Please prepare a complete file for my review and schedule a meeting for next week to discuss employee conduct policies." "Of course, sir. Is there anything else?" "Not at this time." I ended the call and looked directly at Rowick. "Your job is in jeopardy because you used company resources to investigate your family member without authorization. That's a violation of corporate policy and potentially grounds for termination." He looked like he might be sick. "Valentino, you can't." "I can," I said quietly, "just like you could hire researchers to investigate me, just like you could call me a failure in front of our family. Just like you could plan interventions based on assumptions you never bothered to verify." Elmira found her voice. "Are you going to fire him?" I looked at her, then at Uncle Carl, then back at Rowick. "That depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes." "What do you mean?" Carl asked. "I mean this family has a choice to make," I said. "We can continue operating based on assumptions, interventions, and investigations. Or we can start operating based on honesty, respect, and actual communication." I walked back to my chair and sat down for the first time since Leora had entered with her folder of revelations. "But understand this, the power dynamic has changed permanently. I'm not the struggling younger brother who needs your guidance and intervention. I'm a successful adult who also happens to be your employer." The rain outside had intensified again, drumming against the windows with renewed force. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the conference room in stark, momentary brightness. "So what do you want?" Elmira asked, her voice smaller than before. "I want acknowledgement," I said. "I want recognition that you were wrong about me, that your assumptions caused real damage to our relationships, and that going forward, you'll treat me as an equal rather than a problem to be solved." "And if we can't do that?" Rowick asked quietly. I looked at him steadily. Then you'll need to find new jobs. The threat wasn't delivered with anger or satisfaction. It was simply a statement of fact, a consequence of choices made and bridges burned. In the space of one afternoon, the family dynamics that had governed our relationships for years had been completely restructured. Uncle Carl leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. "Valentino, what you've built is impressive. What you've accomplished is remarkable. But using your business position to threaten your family, that's not the man I helped raise." His words carried weight because they came from love rather than fear. Carl wasn't worried about his job or his security. He was worried about who I was becoming in this moment of power and revelation. "You're right," I said after a long pause. "Threats aren't necessary. The truth is sufficient." I looked around the table at the three people who'd shaped my life, who'd supported me through grief and adolescence, who'd worried about my future even as they misunderstood my present. "The truth is that I don't want to fire anyone," I said. "I don't want to destroy relationships or wield power like a weapon. But I also can't pretend that this afternoon didn't happen. I can't go back to being the family disappointment now that you know I'm not." The storm outside was reaching its peak, thunder rolling across the city in waves that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Inside the conference room, 4 family members and one very uncomfortable employee sat with the wreckage of old assumptions scattered around them like debris from the tempest. "So what happens now?" Carl asked. "Now we decide what kind of family we want to be," I said, "and whether we can learn to build relationships based on truth instead of presumptions." The question hung in the air between us, as heavy and consequential as the storm clouds gathering outside. The silence that followed my question stretched for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, the thunder moving farther away, leaving behind the steady rhythm of rain against glass and the distant hum of city traffic 14 floors below. Uncle Carl was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would reshape everything that came after. "Valentino, you're right. We were wrong, not just about your financial situation, but about how we approached you as a person." He looked directly at me, his weathered face showing the kind of honesty that can only come from someone who spent a lifetime taking responsibility for his mistakes. "We treated you like a problem instead of family, and that's on us." Rowick shifted in his chair, finally meeting my eyes for the first time since Leora had revealed the investigation results. "I want to keep my job," he said quietly, "but more than that, I want to keep my brother." The words carried weight because they weren't just about employment or family obligation. They were about acknowledging that relationships matter more than pride, that admitting error requires courage, and that some things can't be fixed with corporate research or intervention strategies. Elmira closed her notebook and set down her pen. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one. I convinced myself that investigating you was an act of love, but it was actually an act of arrogance. I assumed I knew what was best for your life without bothering to understand what your life actually was." Leora, who had remained silent through most of the confrontation, cleared her throat softly. "Should I leave these documents with you, Mr. Ordrick?" I looked at the folder in her hands. The research that had started as an attempt to prove my failure and had instead revealed my success. "No," I said. "Destroy them. All of them. My family doesn't need corporate documentation to know who I am." She nodded and tucked the folder under her arm. "I'll make sure they're properly disposed of." "And Leora?" I called as she reached the door. "Thank you for helping me understand what was really happening today." After she left, the 4 of us sat in the conference room that had become the site of a family reckoning. The power dynamics had shifted permanently, but the love underneath, complicated and sometimes misguided, remained. "So what happens now?" Elmira asked. "Now we start over," I said, "with honesty instead of assumptions, with respect instead of intervention, with curiosity about each other's lives, instead of certainty about what those lives should look like." Carl nodded slowly. "That sounds like something we can build on." The storm outside was clearing, shafts of late afternoon sunlight breaking through the clouds to illuminate the city beyond the windows. Inside, a family was learning how to see each other clearly for the first time in years. 3 months later, I found myself back in the parking garage beneath Pinnacle Heights, but this time I wasn't rushing to make a family meeting. I was early, actually, waiting for my brother and sister to finish their workdays so we could have dinner together. Not a quarterly intervention disguised as family concern, but an actual meal where we talked about our lives, our work, our hopes for the future. The changes hadn't happened overnight. Trust, once broken by assumptions and investigations, required time and consistent action to rebuild. But the foundation we'd laid in that conference room during the storm had proven solid enough to support something new and better. Rowick had kept his position at Meridian Financial, but our relationship had evolved into something neither of us had expected. He'd become genuinely curious about the business side of the companies he worked for, asking thoughtful questions about digital assets, software licensing, and investment strategies. Last week, he'd presented a proposal for expanding Meridian's client services that was both innovative and practical. I'd approved it not because he was my brother, but because it was genuinely good work. Elmira had surprised me the most. After learning about my ownership stake in Sterling & Associates, she'd approached me with a proposition. She wanted to understand how I evaluated and acquired companies. Not to benefit her own position, but because she was fascinated by the process of identifying undervalued assets and building them into successful enterprises. We'd started meeting monthly to discuss potential acquisitions, and her consulting background had proven invaluable in assessing organizational culture and management effectiveness. Uncle Carl had adapted to the new reality with the same steady pragmatism he'd brought to raising us after our father died. "I'm proud of what you've built," he told me over coffee 2 weeks ago. "But I'm prouder of how you handled us when we screwed up. Takes a bigger man to forgive than to hold grudges. But the most significant change wasn't in how my family treated me, it was in how I understood myself. For years, I'd allowed their perception of me to shape my own sense of worth, even as I was building something meaningful and substantial. I'd lived modestly not just because of my values, but because part of me had internalized their belief that I didn't deserve more. The revelation that I was successful hadn't just shocked them, it had forced me to confront the ways I'd been hiding from my own achievements. I'd been so focused on proving I didn't need traditional markers of success, that I'd forgotten to acknowledge what I had accomplished. My phone buzzed with a text from someone I hadn't heard from in weeks. "Mr. Ordrick, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to thank you for what you did that day. Not just helping with my car, but showing me how one moment of kindness can change everything. I've started stopping to help other people when I see them in trouble. It feels good to pay it forward, Leora." I smiled and typed back, "Never inappropriate to share good news. Keep paying it forward." The parking garage had become a symbol for me, a place where assumptions were challenged, where help was offered without expectation of reward, where the smallest actions could ripple outward in ways we couldn't predict. I'd started a mentorship program through my companies, pairing experienced professionals with people who were trying to build non-traditional careers. Not everyone needed to follow the path I'd taken, but everyone deserved the chance to define success on their own terms. As I waited for Rowick and Elmira, I thought about the conference room 14 floors above me, where we'd faced each other across a mahogany table loaded with assumptions, investigations, and interventions. That afternoon had taught me that sometimes the people who love us the most can hurt us the deepest, not through malice, but through the dangerous certainty that they know what's best for our lives. But it had also taught me that families, like businesses, can be restructured, relationships can be rebuilt on better foundations. And sometimes the most profound changes come not from dramatic confrontations, but from the simple decision to start treating each other with the respect and curiosity that love actually requires. The elevator dinged, and Elmira stepped out, followed by Rowick. They were talking animatedly about a project they were collaborating on, something that crossed the boundaries between consulting and financial services, the kind of innovative thinking that emerged when people felt free to share ideas without fear of judgment. "Ready for dinner?" Elmira asked, settling into the passenger seat of my Honda. I'd bought a newer car last month, but I'd kept the old one too. Some things were worth preserving not because they were impressive, but because they reminded you of who you were when nobody else was watching. "Ready," I said, starting the engine. "Where should we go?" "Somewhere we can actually talk," Rowick said from the back seat. "I want to hear about that new software company you're looking at acquiring." As we drove out of the parking garage into the early evening light, I realized that success wasn't just about building wealth or acquiring companies or proving wrong the people who'd underestimated you. Success was about building relationships that could survive the truth, families that could function without facades, and a life that felt authentic whether anyone else understood it or not. The storm had passed completely now, leaving the air clean and bright with possibility. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.